During the time when God sent judges to help Israel, there was a woman named Hannah. Hannah really wanted to have children, but was unable to. One day, she was so sad about this that she burst out crying and praying to God to give her a son. One of the priests of Israel named Eli was nearby and heard her and assumed she was drunk. "How long are you going to stay drunk?" he said to her. "Put down your wine." Hannah explained that she was not drunk, but weeping and praying for God to give her a son. When he heard this, he prayed that she would indeed have a son. Soon after, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel. When he was a young boy, she brought him back to Eli, the priest, and the two of them prayed that God would use Samuel. One night, when Samuel was a little older, God spoke to him in his room, telling him about things that would happen in Israel in the future, called prophecies. This was the beginning of a special relationship between God and Samuel. God would use Samuel to speak to the Israelites over and over as a prophet. But the Israelites weren't satisfied with the prophet. They wanted a king, a military ruler like the other nations around them had. Despite Samuel's warning against it, they demanded God give them a king. Eventually, God told Samuel who to make king, a man named Saul, who was easily a foot taller than any other man, someone the Israelites would trust to lead them. Samuel brought Saul in front of all of Israel. When the Israelites saw him, they shouted, "Long live the king!"
So I'd invite you now to hear the word of the Lord from 1 Samuel chapter 8, if you want to follow along, starting in verse 1 through verse 22. When Samuel became old, he made his son judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not follow in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint to them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s and some to the plow into his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and so that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and set a king over them." Samuel then said to the people of Israel, "Each of you return home." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I have a question for you this morning. Who in this room would consider themselves to be really good at problem solving? Any good troubleshooters or high quality fixers in the room today? You don't have to raise your hands if you don't want to. You might not want everyone to know in case they have problems to bring to you after service today. But if I could be so bold as to start out the message today with a humble brag of sorts, I would consider myself to be in this category of problem solvers on most days. The thing is, I'm uniquely wired for this, and you can ask many people in the room to confirm for you, not the least of which my parents, who are both in attendance today. But my brain is hardwired to anticipate problems, to bet on the worst case scenario, to expect a catastrophe. And while, yes, it can lead to a somewhat stressful existence at times, it has shaped me into someone that is always working towards solutions, resolutions. Backup plans and action steps are two of my very best friends. Friends who stand ready to help me out and lend a hand when potential disaster strikes and get me back to safety. My husband would tell you that usually for me, one solution to even an imagined or perceived problem is not enough. I have a plan A, B, C, and D. And if those don't work, well, just give me a minute. I've got this. Is this resonating with anyone else here? And in this passage we're exploring today, we see some similar dynamics at work. As is often the case with stories in the biblical text, Israel's got problems. They've got legitimate, scary, unstable issues that need to be addressed. To be sure, Israel has lots of problems. The one we talked about in the biblical text today is the leadership problem. It says in 1 Samuel 8, 1 and 3, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. Yet his sons did not follow in his ways, but turned aside. They took bribes. They perverted justice. So Israel does what all good, initiative-taking, proactive problem solvers love to do. They have a meeting. And this is kind of an aside, but you might hear the faint, ironic chuckling of my coworkers here in the room today. Because while most people complain about meetings in the workplace, I love a good meeting. Are you having a meeting this week? You should invite me. Anywhere people are gathered and chatting through things, I am in. Seriously, I will come, and I think you will love that I came. But anyways, I digress. Back to Israel. Israel called a meeting, and it is there they come up with a solution to their problem to take to their leader Samuel, God's appointed priest, prophet, and judge over them at this time. And their request is this: Israel wants a king. In fact, as we watched and heard earlier, they don't just want a king. They are outright insisting on it. Israel spelled out their demands really clearly to Samuel, in fact. They want a king that they recognize. They want a king like other nations, a king with physical strength, a king that they can see and predict, a king with the ability to wield military might against their enemies. The problem is, Israel's request for a king isn't just the wrong move, which it is the wrong move, as a series of bad, very bad kings ends up being the cause of Israel's political and physical demise, scattering them into exile. That's a few books later. But God is grieved by their request, not to mention Samuel too. Israel's request is, in fact, an outright rejection of God himself. And I guess the hard question, and perhaps every other earnest, genuine, hard worker, problem solver out there in the room wants to ask it with me, is why? Why is Israel's desire for a king so egregious after all? Israel is facing problems that all the nations around them are facing. Hostile enemies inciting violence, corrupt officials failing to lead, political instability. Is any of this sounding familiar? So they looked around at what everyone else was doing about it and came up with a reasonable, vetted, decent proposal. One they'd seen played out and felt they could bet on. So why is God offended? Why his affront? The language used in this text is full of emotion, actually. It's clear God is experiencing rejection, even pain, at Israel's request for a king. And my best educated theological guess as to why is this: Israel's demand for a king, they're at their core transactional. Give us a king so we can be like other nations. Give us a king so he can defeat those who oppose us in battle. Give us a king so governing is simpler and more straightforward. But Yahweh's relationship with Israel was never meant to be a transaction. With Israel, if you'll remember, God established a covenant. In Genesis 12, 1-3, and speaking with Abraham, Israel's great forefather, God lays out what this covenant will look like. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And in Genesis 15-18, just a little bit later, God makes it official. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, I give this land. And yes, while covenants can be broadly understood in legal transactional terms, you do this, I'll do that. This word that's used here in the scripture over and over in the Old Testament, covenant, the Hebrew word berith, goes so far beyond that. It means a sacred kinship bond between two parties. Covenants involved a binding oath, an exchange of faith, and an actual exchange of life. In forging a covenant with Israel, God proclaimed over them, I am yours and you are mine. In other words, Israel and Yahweh are meant to be so bound up in one another that Israel is shaped more and more to resemble the spotless, sacred goodness and otherness of God. This is what we call holiness. A few chapters later, God continues to speak to Israel about the nature of this covenant. But I've said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God. I have separated you from the people, so you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have separated you from the other peoples to be mine. From the very outset of Israel's relationship, God separated Israel on purpose and for a purpose. He called them out. God gave himself to Israel, committed to them, not just for the sake of delivering them, but of perfecting them, shaping them into a people who will be so distinct and different, who would stand out so clearly because of their proximity to God's radiant glory, a people who would follow him closely, so closely they couldn't help but be a blessing to the entire world around them. Through this bound together, mashed up, transforming and transformational relationship, God would use his people Israel to bring glory to him. But what is Israel asking for verbatim after years and years of walking with him, being delivered by him, being led through the wilderness and into the land that was promised? Israel wants to look like everyone else. In their attempt to solve their leadership problem, Israel is shaping God into their own image instead of the other way around. God knows their desire for a lesser earthly king will ultimately be a barrier to their own journey toward holiness, of being shaped by their Creator, instead of trying to find something or someone to follow who is more accessible, more manageable, more familiar. And I think this is where this passage could start to step on all sorts of our toes, because I think this is something we do all the time. Instead of choosing to be bound up with God in this journey to becoming more like him, we do like Israel does. We make these cheap trades, or at the very least, we settle and give authority to people and philosophies and treasures that this world has to offer to gain a sense of stability, or to maybe find a little upward momentum, to find status like the other nations would define it. How often are we looking to the right and the left like Israel? And we see problems, but instead of looking to God for the way forward, we mindlessly grab at the solutions that the world has to offer, the ones that are already in our problem-solving tool belts. We shape God into the image of our own political positions or superimpose our own preferences over the call of God in our lives. Let's be honest, following God with all we've got, it can feel daunting sometimes. So we shift our priorities and redefine our focus. We divert our energies and passions towards reaching for something more attainable than holiness. We strive for things like fitness or fame or financial freedom and all kinds of different forms of self-actualization and success. And sure, we try to better ourselves, but we resort to using the tools in our toolbox to become our best selves, to live our best lives, to make it happen on our own. And while many of these pursuits that we give ourselves over to are not bad, they actually have value and are beneficial, just like some of these kings that they'll have over the next few hundred years. But I think there's this question to be asked today about why it's so easy to let ourselves be shaped by what the world has to offer and can feel so hard to give ourselves over to the enormity of God's invitation to us to be utterly His, to be caught up completely into His covenant plan for us. So many of you know I've got a couple of beautiful, enchanting kiddos, more enchanting some days than others. Their names are Daisy and Dean, and they're ages 4 and 6 years old. And something about me is I've always loved playing with my kids. From their earliest years, I've enjoyed sitting on the floor and creating with blocks or crafting or coloring, doing puzzles with them, or heading outside to go on walks or jump on a trampoline. I'm definitely the mom that wants to be in on the fun. My daughter Daisy, however, has hit this really normal, super healthy stage the last year or so where she's wanting to play a lot of really imaginative games. You guys know the ones where the princess has been captured by the pirates and the brave little toaster, along with his trusty pet dragon, have to set off on a quest to save the day. Or more recently, both Daisy and Dean have gotten really into Star Wars and love to be Jedis. Here's a picture of them with their lightsabers. They got new ones this past weekend when they went to visit their Gigi. My mom said Daisy kept saying, "I am the master Jedi and you are the young Jedi," to Dean. But the thing about these games is all reality is suspended. Everything is made up, and it's a whole new world coming into existence. They're making up the characters and creating dialogue and scenarios on the spot, and they want me to participate. And I've actually found it's really hard for me to play these kinds of games with them. See, I thought my imagination was pretty well developed, but I will admit to you, I have learned it needs some work. It's really hard for me to invent my superhero name and my unique superpower on the fly, or come up with the title of the planet we're flying to as Jedis on our starship, or stay engaged in these beautiful moments of imagining and creating with my kids. I think it's because as I'm trying to envision all these new realities, I'm looking around my own house and there's real laundry to do. There's real groceries to buy and real work to catch up on. I find my mind wandering, even with maybe a princess crown on my head or a cape around my neck, to the practical, tangible, real-life stuff I've got to take care of and how I can take care of it. Isn't it just true that the heaviness and the in-your-face immediacy of the world around us can make it hard to imagine much of anything new? It all kind of makes me think Jesus was onto something when he said in the Gospels, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." If you keep reading in 1 Samuel, we discover it's true. God did relent and give Israel the king they asked for, and a king after that, and a king after that, and so on and so forth until the disastrous collapse of the monarchy. But thank goodness God's plan of redemption for us moved far beyond the failed leadership that Israel wanted and that this world has to offer. And through the saving work of his son, a whole new kingdom has come, one where Jesus reigns supreme. Walter Brueggemann, one of my favorite theologians, put it like this: the real world in which God invites us to live is not the one made available to us by the rulers of this age. And here's the thing, friends, I get so caught up in this too. We think we've got to play by the rules of this world, but we're actually called to live as a part of a whole different one. And not just live, but to announce it, to be a part of bringing it forward. And as hard as it is, if we can stop looking to the left and to the right, then maybe we can look to Jesus. And as we do, we can begin to imagine a world where it's possible to turn the other cheek instead of seeking revenge. A reality that chooses justice and mercy, that willingly turns away from the pull of greed and self-interest. We can begin to envision afresh a place where it's possible to forgive 77 times and still have enough grace to spare. A world where we can let Jesus be king instead of trying to maneuver and manipulate our own will into action. If I'm honest, I think this lack of imagination isn't just a problem for child's play. It's a spiritual one too. In Ephesians 3:20, it says this: God is able to do exceedingly, abundantly, and above all you could ever ask, imagine, or think, according to his power at work in you. To him be the glory. What if as a church, we're willing to go all in with this covenant, first extended to Israel, but that has now been extended to us through Christ, to be so bound up with God each day, becoming more and more like him, instead of trying to make him like us. Believing that his power has the capacity to bust through all our expectations of what's possible. What if we believe that his love and his spirit working in and through us really can make this whole world new?